Right, well, this is when I went to university a very long time ago, 1964, to do maths. There was a guy at Cambridge who was a fairly new lecturer who offered a postgraduate course on sort of infinite sets and different sizes of infinity. Some work that was done in the quite controversial work that was done in the 19th century. So I went to this course and very much enjoyed it. I don't seem to have taken any notes. I had a look at my lecture notes today, but I actually can't find any notes on the course. And it was given by a man called John Conway. John Conway was born in Liverpool in 1939 and went to Cambridge and became a lecturer and became a professor there. And then went to Princeton in the United States. And he died this month. He died on the 11th of April of the virus, aged 82. So I thought on learning that he died, I'd say something about a particular thing he worked on. One of the things he's best known for, but he was always a bit cross about this, was something called the game of life. And this is technically something called the cellular automaton. And it's a sort of game where you start with a pattern, and then there are rules for how you get from one pattern to the next one. And you apply these rules successively, and you see how the patterns evolve. So let me just try and show this to you, if I can get this to work. So you can now, if I just, the rules are, there's a grid of squares here. And if you click on this, if I do this, this square is now considered a live square and all the other squares are dead. And we will start with a certain pattern of live squares. And the rule is to get from one pattern to the next one. What happens is each square has 8 neighboring squares. There are the 4 sort of on the other side of the sides, and then there are 4 diagonal ones. There are 8 adjacent squares. And the rule is that when you go to the next step, if a live square has 2 or 3 neighboring live squares, it survives. Otherwise it dies. If it's got fewer than 2 or 3, it's considered to be lonely, so it dies. If it's got more than 2 and 3, it's considered to be crowded, so it dies. The other rule is if a dead square has 3 neighboring live squares, then it becomes a live square. So just to demonstrate a very simple thing, if we just take this pattern of 3 squares, and if you look at this, the middle square there, the middle yellow square, has 2 neighboring yellow squares, 2 neighboring live squares, so it will survive. But the top yellow square, only has 1 neighboring yellow square, so it will die, and the bottom square will also die. But this square here at the side here, that has 3 neighboring live squares, so when we do the step, that will come to life, and the same thing for the one on the other side. So if we do the next thing, we get this pattern here. And if we just run a sequence of things, it'll just alternate. So that's not terribly exciting, but that's what happens with that pattern. But if we take a square, let me just clear that. Sorry, I have a bit of trouble making this work. But if I take a slightly different pattern, sorry, this will just take me a moment to set up. Oops, that's not right. This is a pretty simple pattern, but if we look at this and follow the sequence, following those rules, we get this. In fact, if I run it, we see it's a sort of, it just continues, it just walks across the screen. And you can actually get quite much more elaborate things than this. If I just do another one. So I have to go via this. It's the only way I can get this to clear properly. If I take something like this, oops. So just take me a moment to set this one up. Again, it's quite a simple pattern. Just one more. If we do this one and we just run the sequence, it goes to all sorts of, so from that very simple pattern, by these very simple rules, you can get this very complicated behavior. which is, I think, partly why it's called the game of life, because the idea is that life developed by a process of evolution out of very simple things. And this sort of goes on now more or less forever, just doing all these crazy patterns. One of the things that Conway conjectured, is what mathematicians do. I'll just stop that, except I can't stop it, was that there was a limit to how many squares you could get in doing this. If you started with a small number of squares, you wouldn't actually finish up with more than perhaps some limit on the number of the other squares. But somebody in MIT towards the end of the year, towards the end of 1970, when this was invented, showed that this is impossible. So if you start with this unlikely configuration and run this, following those rules, it just trundles along for a bit. And then I'll perhaps just speed it up slightly. Trundles along, and then it actually spits out a little thing, actually the one that I showed you earlier on, called the glider. Yes, it'll come out in a moment, I hope. Here it comes. Here comes the first glider. So every now and again, it spits out. It just goes on forever, just moving things around and spitting out these gliders. Here comes the next one. Speed it up even more. This is all following these very simple rules, and you get this amazing behavior. And there's an enormous variety of behavior you can get. So people, it caused quite a stir. There was an article in Scientific American about this in 1970 in the mathematical column, and it was apparently there were more responses to this article than any others. So I just thought I'd tell you about this, partly just in memory of John Conway, whose lecture course in 1964 I very much enjoyed, and who thought of invented this setup in 1970, and who died earlier this month. So thank you for that, John Conway.